This is the unknown zone, where the engines of history roar and where the skies above Europe still echo with the thunder of machines that changed the course of a world at war. The B-17 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a fortress, a steel giant with wings wide as hope and engines that refused to die. Thousands of young men climbed into its narrow fuselage, knowing the odds were against them, knowing that every mission into the grey skies of occupied Europe might be their last. They faced flak bursts that shook the heavens, fighters that carved the sky into fire, and cold winds so brutal they froze flesh, metal, and bone. But they kept flying, again and again, because the world depended on it. This is the story of courage at altitude, a story of men who fought not just the enemy, but the sky itself. This is the legend of the B-17 flying fortress. In the years before World War II erupted across the world, the United States was preparing for a conflict it hoped would never come. But the world was changing. Europe was shaking, and America understood one thing clearly. If war spread across continents, victory would depend on whoever controlled the skies. The U.S. Army Air Corps needed an aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber built before. They needed a machine that could cross oceans of sky, carry thousands of pounds of explosives, take devastating damage, and still bring its crew home alive. They needed something impossible. What they built was the Flying Fortress. The story began in 1934 when the US government issued a request for a long-range bomber. Martin, Douglas, and Boeing, three giants of American aviation, competed for the contract. Martin built a safe, conservative design. Douglas did the same. Boeing did not. Instead, Boeing engineers locked themselves inside a workshop and drew something far more ambitious, a huge bomber with 4 engines instead of 2, a machine capable of climbing above storms, flying over mountains, and crossing entire countries without landing. They envisioned a beast, a fortress in the sky. When Boeing rolled out the prototype, reporters stared in disbelief. Its massive wings stretched across the airfield, its engines gleamed beneath the sun, and its fuselage carried multiple gun positions like the turrets of a battleship. One reporter whispered, "It looks like a flying fortress." The name stuck instantly. That first prototype was designated the Model 299. It flew like nothing America had ever seen, fast, stable, powerful. A bomber built not for a single battlefield, but for a global war still unseen. But tragedy struck. During a demonstration flight, the prototype crashed due to a simple oversight. The crew had forgotten to disengage the gas locks. The bomber exploded into flames. 2 men died. The press declared the project doomed, and the government cancelled the purchase. But the Air Corps was not willing to let it die. They had witnessed the aircraft's potential. They had seen its speed, its firepower, its range. They quietly ordered more test models, hoping to salvage the design, because they sensed something no one else understood yet. The future of air war belonged to machines like this. As tensions escalated in Europe, Boeing continued refining the aircraft. They strengthened the frame, increased the armor, improved the gun turrets, and expanded the internal bomb bays. By 1938, the B-17 was ready, a giant of riveted aluminum and roaring engines. A bomber that could fly over 2,000 miles, carry more than 4,000 pounds of bombs, and defend itself from nearly every angle, using up to 13 machine guns firing in all directions. No bomber in the world had anything like it, but its true test was still ahead. When World War II exploded across Europe in 1939, America remained officially neutral. Still, U.S. military planners watched carefully as German forces devastated Poland, crushed the Low Countries, and pushed Britain to the edge of survival. Air power had changed the world. The Luftwaffe proved it. And the United States understood that if the war pulled them in, they would need long-range bombers capable of reaching the heart of enemy territory. The B-17 became that aircraft. Its first major test came not in Europe, but in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, when Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, dozens of B-17s were destroyed on the ground, but the surviving aircraft became some of the first machines to strike back. They flew missions across the Pacific, bombing enemy bases, shipping routes, and airfields. Yet it was in Europe that the B-17 Flying Fortress would earn its legend. In 1942, the first B-17 groups arrived in England to join the newly formed 8th Air Force. British commanders watched these massive bombers roll down the airfield with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Britain had been fighting Germany for years. They knew the power of flak guns, the brutality of German fighters, and the cost of daylight raids. When American air leaders announced that the B-17 would fly strategic missions in broad daylight at high altitude, British officers were stunned. They called it suicide. But the Americans believed in their doctrine: precision bombing from high altitude to destroy key industrial targets without flattening cities. For this tactic to work, their bombers had to survive the daylight sky, and the B-17 was their answer. Crews climbing into the Flying Fortress found themselves on board a machine built for punishment. The aircraft was fast for its size, but it was never meant to outrun danger. It was built to endure it. Its armor plates protected the cockpit and key systems. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. Its wings were reinforced with heavy spars, and its multiple gun positions allowed the crew to defend the aircraft from nearly every angle. Each mission involved 10 men, each with a role: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio, operator, flight engineer, ball turret gunner, waist gunners, and tail gunner. These men became family in a freezing metal world 6 miles above the earth. At high altitude, the temperature inside the bomber could drop to 40 degrees below zero. Frost formed on oxygen masks. Metal froze to bare skin. Gunners wore heated suits with electric wiring running through them to prevent frostbite. The engines roared like thunder. Flak bursts shook the entire fuselage. If a bomber took a direct hit, shrapnel tore through aluminum like ripping paper. But even then, the B-17 often kept flying. Stories began spreading across airfields of flying fortresses, returning home with huge holes in their wings, engines destroyed, fuselages torn apart, and tail sections nearly severed. The aircraft was not just a bomber. It was a survivor. But survival was not guaranteed. When the B-17s first flew deep into German territory, they faced a sky controlled by the Luftwaffe. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs swarmed them, attacking head-on, from above, from below, and from behind. The German fighters knew that hitting the B-17 from the front was the quickest way to kill the pilot and bombardier. The air battles became brutal. Bombers burned in the sky. Parachutes drifted down over enemy territory. For the men who flew the Flying Fortress, every mission was a gamble against death. But even as losses mounted, the legend of the B-17 grew stronger. Survivors spoke of bombers flying home with 2 engines dead, with wings shredded, with turrets gone, with control cables severed. One B-17 returned with half its tail missing. Another landed safely with a gaping hole big enough for a man to crawl through. The aircraft earned its name again and again. A fortress, not just in firepower, but in endurance. The B-17 would go on to bomb shipyards, factories, rail yards, airfields, bridges and oil refineries, crippling Germany's ability to wage war. But its most terrifying missions were still ahead. Deeper targets, tighter defenses, skies filled with flak so thick that crews said you could walk on it. Those missions will define the heart of this story. By late 1942, American aircrews stationed in England knew they were preparing for something far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. The B-17 Flying Fortress had proven itself durable and powerful. But the missions ahead would test not just the aircraft, but the men who flew it. They were about to enter the most heavily defended airspace in the world. Before the Americans arrived, the British had learned a brutal lesson. The skies of Germany were a fortress of their own. Anti-aircraft guns ringed every major city. Radar stations swept the heavens. Fighter squadrons stood ready to scramble at a moment's notice. The Luftwaffe controlled Europe's air with extraordinary speed and discipline. To fly into that sky in daylight seemed suicidal. But the Americans had a different doctrine. Precision, bombing, striking specific military and industrial targets, rather than leveling entire cities. To do that, they had to see their targets clearly. And that meant flying into enemy territory in full daylight with the sun glinting off their silver wings. In early 1943, the B-17 groups began deep penetration raids over France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Even these missions were dangerous enough. Flak batteries lined the coasts. German fighters swarmed from hidden airfields. But these early strikes were only a prelude. The targets that mattered most lay far deeper inside Germany. Industrial plants, ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, and aircraft assembly lines. The war machine of Hitler's Reich was vast, complex, and heavily protected. To strike it, the B-17 crews would have to fly straight into the heart of Fortress Europe. When a mission was announced, the tension began long before takeoff. Crews gathered in briefing rooms before dawn, red lights casting eerie shadows across the tired faces. A curtain would be drawn to reveal a map of Europe, marked with thick lines showing the route in, the route out, and the target. If the line stretched deep into Germany, a whisper would fill the room. The men understood the price those missions demanded. Officers laid out weather conditions, enemy defenses, and expected fighter encounters. They described flak concentrations in chilling detail. Flak heavy and accurate from this point to this point. Then came the worst sound of all, the numbers. The number of aircraft expected not to return. Everyone in the room imagined their bomber among them. After the briefing, crews walked across freezing runways toward their aircraft. The B-17 stood like steel giants in the morning mist, engines waiting to roar to life. Ground crews made final checks. Guns loaded, fuel tanks filled, bombs secured. Inside the bomber, each man prepared his station. The navigator spread maps across his table. The bombardier adjusted the northern bomb sight. Gunners secured ammunition belts and tested their turrets. Every man knew his role. Every role depended on the others. Because once the engines throttled forward and the bomber left the ground, their lives were tied together by steel, oxygen, and faith. The takeoff sequence was a spectacle of raw power. One by one, 4 engines on each bomber roared to life. A thunderous growl echoed across the airfield. The runway vibrated as aircraft after aircraft lifted off into the grey morning sky, forming a massive aerial armada. Dozens of bombers, then hundreds, each one a small fortress filled with men on their way to face death. The first stage of the mission was formation assembly, the most stressful part before reaching enemy territory. Hundreds of bombers circled over England at different altitudes, slowly forming combat boxes. The B-17s flew so close that pilots could see the expressions of men in neighboring aircraft. Tight formation meant survival. Machine guns from multiple aircraft could cover all angles, but it also meant that a single mistake could send 2 bombers colliding in midair. As the formation crossed the North Sea and reached the European coast, the men braced themselves. The first bursts of flak usually greeted them as soon as they crossed into enemy territory. Black puffs appeared in the sky like ink stains, each burst throwing metal fragments in every direction. The bomber shook violently whenever flak exploded nearby. Shrapnel tore into the fuselage, punched holes in aluminum, and shattered glass. But the B-17 was built to withstand the storm. Once deep inside German airspace, flak became more concentrated. Anti-aircraft batteries up and down the Rhine, around industrial centers, and across rail networks filled the sky with fire. Crews described the experience as flying through a black wall. A storm of explosions, so thick that they could feel the shock waves in their bones. The enemy fighters usually attacked next. German fighters waited in the clouds for the bombers to approach the target. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s dove toward the formation again and again. They fired 20mm cannons and heavy machine guns that sliced through metal like lightning. The B-17 gunners responded with belts of 50 caliber rounds, their tracer bullets streaking across the sky. Gun turrets spun furiously, shell casings piled on the floor. The ball turret gunner, curled inside a small sphere or beneath the bomber, fired at enemies attacking from below. The tail gunner watched the sky behind them for fighters diving for the kill. The top turret gunner protected the engines and cockpit, and the waist gunners scanned the heavens for anything that moved. Inside the bomber, it was chaos. Shouting, firing, vibrations, wind roaring through bullet holes, and metal shuddering as the aircraft was struck again and again. Through all of this, the pilot kept the bomber steady. The navigator called out course corrections. The bombardier prepared for the final run. Because no matter how intense the battle became, the mission could only end one way. They had to reach the target and drop the bombs. Turning around early was not an option. Once the bomb bay doors opened, a freezing blast of air rushed through the fuselage. The bombardier took control of the aircraft, using the Norden bomb sight. During these moments, the bomber flew straight and level, a perfect target for flak gunners below. This was the deadliest part of every mission. Bombs fell in long lines, each explosion below shaking the earth. And when the last bomb dropped, the pilot shouted the words every crew member longed to hear. "Bombs away, let's go home." But going home was never guaranteed. The return flight was just as dangerous as the way in. Damaged engines, loss of fuel, wounded crew members, and endless stretches of enemy territory made survival uncertain. Some B-17s pulled out of formation, limping on one engine, fuselages shredded, smoke trailing behind them. Some crash-landed in fields. Some glided into the sea. Some never returned at all. By the end of 1943, the B-17 crews had proven extraordinary courage. They had flown missions that stretched human endurance to its limits. They had faced skies filled with fire and steel. They had fought enemy fighters for hours at a time. But the most brutal missions were still ahead. Targets so deep inside Germany that reaching them felt impossible. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Berlin. Each name would become a chapter in the legend of the Flying Fortress. By late 1943, the men of the 8th Air Force understood a brutal truth. Every mission into Germany was a roll of the dice. They had flown over France, over the Netherlands, over Belgium. But now, the targets lay deeper, buried in the industrial core of Hitler's war machine. These missions had names that would burn themselves into the memories of everyone who survived them. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, Kiel, Stuttgart, Berlin. Each one of these cities was a fortress of steel, guns, and fire. The first Schweinfurt raid, October 14th, 1923. A day that would become known as Black Thursday. The target was the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, vital to the German military. Destroy them, and German production would collapse. The Americans believed the strike was worth the risk. But the Germans knew what Schweinfurt meant too. They prepared everything they had. When the bombers reached the border of Germany, the Luftwaffe was waiting. Dozens of Bf-109s and Fw-190s smashed into the formation again and again like wolves attacking a herd. The sky turned into a battlefield stretching for miles. Cannons roared. Tracer rounds sliced the air. Fragments of exploding shells rattled against metal like hail. Inside each bomber, men fought for their lives. The air gunners' machine guns jammed from the cold. Their oxygen masks froze, and the smell of burning metal filled the fuselage. But the bombers pushed on. Above Schweinfurt, the sky became a nightmare. The flak was so heavy that crews said it looked like black snow. Each blast rocked the bomber violently. The noise was deafening, the shock waves like being hit by invisible fists. But the bombardiers held steady. They aligned the northern bomb sight, called out wind corrections, and released their payloads over the factories below. Flames rose through the haze. The city shook. And then came the hardest part, flying home through the same hell they had just crossed. The Luftwaffe attacked relentlessly on the return flight. Bomber after bomber fell from the sky. Some exploded midair. Some spiraled down in flames. Some broke apart, pieces scattering across fields and forests. The B-17s that survived returned to England with wings shredded, canopies shattered, and engines dead. That day, out of 291 B-17s, 60 were shot down. More than 600 airmen were killed, captured, or missing. Entire crews disappeared in seconds. It was the single deadliest day in American air combat history. Regensburg, the mission that nearly broke the Air Force. Just weeks earlier, another mission had tested the limits of the Flying Fortress. On August 17, 1943, the B-17s were ordered to strike Regensburg, a factory building the feared Messerschmitt Bf-109. To reach the target, they had to fly deep across Germany without long-range fighter escort. They knew the risk. They went anyway. As soon as the bombers crossed the coast, German fighters bounced. Wave after wave of Messerschmitts attacked from head-on, their cannon shells exploding against cockpit glass and tearing at the fuselage. Gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Empty shell casings rolled across the floor. The smell of gunpowder and hot metal filled the narrow fuselage. Still, the B-17s pushed forward. Flak over Regensburg was so intense that bombers trembled like tin cans. Bombardiers dropped their loads through the smoke and explosions. Once the bombs fell, the crews faced a new terror. They were ordered not to return to England. They had to fly all the way to North Africa because the factories below had to be destroyed at any cost. The Luftwaffe chased them almost the entire way. It was one of the longest, most brutal missions the B-17 would ever fly. By the time the bombers reached Africa, many had one engine left. Some had none. Some crash-landed in the desert, sliding across the sand in a shower of dust and sparks. Only half of the bombers made it back, but the mission succeeded. Regensburg's aircraft production was crippled. The cost, however, was devastating. Berlin, the city of fire. By early 1944, American commanders decided to strike the heart of Nazi power, Berlin. Every German fighter pilot knew the importance of the city. They swore to defend it to the last bullet. The first B-17 to reach Berlin did so through a wall of fire. Flak erupted from every district. The sky shook. Bombers disappeared in flashes of light. But one thing became immediately clear. The flying fortress could reach Berlin and survive. Not all survived, but enough did to prove a point that terrified the German command. The war in the air was turning. The B-17 that refused to die. Among the thousands of missions flown during these years, stories emerged of near miraculous survival. One B-17 landed in England with its nose blown open. Another returned with more than 200 holes in its fuselage. Another had its tail barely hanging on by a few metal struts, but still landed safely. Crew members stepped out, shaken, exhausted, frostbitten, but alive. The flying fortress earned its name every single day. But even legends have their limits. Losses were so high that commanders knew continued daylight raids deep into Germany would eventually break the Air Force itself. The B-17 needed a partner. Something with the speed and range to fight off the German fighters that shredded the bomber formations. A savior was coming from American airfields. A long-range fighter with massive drop tanks, 8 wing-mounted guns, and the speed to chase the Luftwaffe across all of Europe. A fighter that would change everything. The P-51 Mustang. By early 1944, the daylight bombing campaign over Germany was close to breaking. Crews were exhausted. Losses were staggering. Entire groups returned with half their aircraft missing. Some missions ended with only a handful of planes struggling back to England like wounded animals limping home. Commanders asked themselves a painful question. How long until the 8th Air Force was bled dry? The B-17 was strong. Its crews were brave. But bravery alone could not stop the Luftwaffe. The bombers needed protection. Not for the first 100 miles, not for half the route, but all the way to the heart of Germany and back. Until now, no fighter on earth could do that. But everything was about to change. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang. When the first Mustangs arrived in England, their sleek frames and powerful engines immediately caught attention. It wasn't just a fighter, it was a predator. Long wings, a low aerodynamic profile, a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that sang even at high altitude, and with drop tanks attached, it could fly deep into Germany, stay on station, fight enemy aircraft, and escort the bombers all the way home. The B-17 crews had never seen anything like it. First escort missions. When the American officers announced the first fully escorted deep strike, crews felt something they had not felt in months. Relief, hope, protection. As the bombers crossed the coast and the first formations of P-51s appeared above them, gunners cheered, hands slammed against bulkheads. Some pilots even cried. The flying fortress was no longer alone. The turning of the air war, German fighter pilots quickly realized their world had changed. Before the Mustang, the Luftwaffe controlled the high skies. They attacked bombers at will, picking off stragglers, breaking formations, and choosing the moment of engagement. Now, the hunters had become the hunted. The P-51 didn't just defend the bombers. It chased the Luftwaffe. It pursued them across Germany. It shot them down over their own airfields. It eliminated the escort gap that had cost thousands of bomber crew lives. The sky was no longer theirs. The bombing campaign intensifies. With Mustang protection, the B-17 attacks became far more aggressive. Targets once considered impossible now became reachable. Synthetic fuel plants, aircraft assembly lines, rail hubs, munitions centers. The American strategy was simple: cut off Germany's ability to fight. And it worked. Day after day, the flying fortresses and their fighter escorts punched deeper into Germany. They destroyed factories that could not be rebuilt, railroads that could not be repaired, fuel that could not be replaced. By mid-1944, Germany's fuel production had collapsed. Pilots flew fewer and fewer missions. Training hours for new pilots dropped from months to mere days. Experienced aces were lost faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe was dying in the air. Berlin, Merseburg, and the largest battles in the sky. The B-17 raids against Berlin became symbols of Allied strength. Thousands of bombers flew over the German capital, dropping tons of bombs on industrial targets that fed the Nazi war machine. Merseburg, home to vital fuel plants, became one of the deadliest targets. Flak was so intense that veterans said you could feel it before you even saw it. But now, the bombers arrived with fighter screens above and around them. German interceptors were met at every altitude by swarms of Mustangs and other escorts. The balance had shifted. The bombers could finally do their job. The cost of victory. Even with the Mustang, the missions remained deadly. The skies were filled with flak bursts that tore through wings and shattered instrument panels. Bombers still fell. Gunners still died fighting off attackers. Engines still caught fire. Fuselages still split open from shrapnel and bullets. But the difference now was survival. Before Mustangs arrived, entire bomber groups were wiped out. After, the losses became manageable. Men still risked their lives, but now they had a fighting chance. The B-17's reputation becomes legendary. By late 1944, stories of B-17s returning home in impossible condition became more frequent. One bomber landed with its nose completely missing. Another returned with 3 engines dead. Another came back with its tail nearly severed from the fuselage. The B-51 helped them get home, but the B-17 kept them alive long enough to try. Now, the bombers and fighters together formed a weapon so powerful that it shattered the Luftwaffe's backbone and opened the skies for the final push into Germany. The war moves toward its end. As Allied ground forces pushed into Europe, the B-17 shifted roles. Rail lines, troop concentrations, bridges, and defensive positions became primary targets. With German industry collapsing and the Luftwaffe weakened, many missions became dominating displays of air power rather than desperate fights for survival. But the war was not over. The B-17 still had one final chapter ahead. A chapter filled with destruction, controversy, and a legacy that would shape the future of aerial warfare. By the winter of 1944, the sound of B-17s roaring across Europe had become part of the rhythm of the war. Day after day, their engines shook the clouds. Their shadows crossed fields, rivers, and ruined cities below. Every mission carried the same mixture of fear, determination, and duty. But now, the tide of the war was turning faster than ever. Germany's ability to produce fuel, aircraft, and munitions was collapsing under the pressure of relentless Allied bombing and the advancing ground forces. Still, the B-17 crews knew their work was far from over. The Battle of the Bulge, the sky, returns to the fight. In December 1944, Germany launched its final major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. A sudden, massive counterattack through the Ardennes caught the Allies by surprise. Fog, snow, and brutal winter storms crowded most plains. Bomber crews waited on bases, watching the weather inch by inch, knowing American soldiers on the ground were fighting without air support. Then, on December 23rd, the clouds broke. Blue sky opened over Europe, and the B-17s took to the air again. Hundreds of flying fortresses roared across the snow-covered forests below, striking German supply lines, rail yards, fuel depots, and troop concentrations. The offensive collapsed, and the crews knew they had helped stop Germany's final gamble. The Siegen raid, precision against all odds. In March 1945, one of the most difficult remaining targets was the rail complex at Siegen. It was heavily defended. It was buried deep in Germany, and the roads and rail lines were essential to the German retreat. The B-17s flew through severe turbulence and thick flak to reach the target. Clouds forced lower bombing altitudes. Fighters swarmed from below. Yet the formations held tight. The bombs hit their mark, cutting off vital retreat routes as Allied ground forces closed in on the Rhine. These late missions showed the resilience and unwavering discipline of men who had been fighting for years in the sky. The Dresden firestorm, a controversial chapter. In February 1945, British and American forces bombed Dresden, a city known for its cultural landmarks and historical architecture. British night raids and American daylight raids combined to create one of the most devastating firestorms in history. The destruction of Dresden remains one of the most debated and morally questioned actions of the entire war. For the B-17 crews involved, the mission was another target assigned by High Command. But many airmen carried the weight of that decision for the rest of their lives. The legacy of the Flying Fortress is not just heroism and survival. It is also the sobering reality of the immense destructive power unleashed in modern war. The last missions of the Flying Fortress. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the B-17s shifted focus. Rail yards, communication centers, and remaining pockets of resistance became primary targets. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former power. Fuel shortages grounded fighters. Airfields were bombed and abandoned. New pilots lacked experience. On some missions, the B-17 formations encountered almost no resistance, a silent acknowledgement that the air war had been won. The final B-17 missions hit targets near Munich, Nuremberg, and Berlin as Germany slipped toward defeat. Victory in Europe. The war ends. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Celebrations erupted across Europe and at air bases throughout England. For many bomber crews, relief came mixed with grief. They remembered empty bunks, missing faces, and the haunting image of burning aircraft falling from frozen skies. The Flying Fortress had carried them through the darkest years of their lives, and now the war was over. The B-17. After the war. When peace returned, the B-17's role changed. Some were scrapped. Some were sold as surplus. Some became firefighting aircraft. Some were used for research and test missions. A few were preserved in museums and air shows, their polished aluminum reflecting sunlight like they once reflected the fire of battle. And some B-17s were flown home with their crews for the last time, touching down on American soil with engines rumbling like a final salute. The legacy of the Flying Fortress. The B-17 is remembered today not just as a machine, but as a symbol of endurance, courage, and sacrifice. Its crews were young men who climbed into a cold metal world day after day, knowing that death waited in the sky. They did it anyway. More than 12,700 B-17s were built. Thousands were shot down. Tens of thousands of airmen were killed, captured, or wounded. But the Flying Fortress helped break the industrial backbone of the Nazi war machine. It helped liberate Europe. It helped end the deadliest conflict in human history. And its legend endures in every museum, every air show, every photograph of young men standing proudly beside the bomber they called home. The B-17 Flying Fortress was more than a bomber. It was a lifeline, a symbol of hope carried on 4 engines through the frozen skies of Europe. It was flown by boys who became men before they ever touched the ground again, men who faced fire, fear, and the full weight of war from 10,000 feet above the earth. They climbed into those aircraft, knowing the risks, knowing the odds, knowing that every mission might be their last. But they flew anyway, not for glory, not for medals, but because the world needed them to. The Flying Fortress helped close factories, cut supply lines, break enemy defenses, and push back a darkness that threatened the world. Its story is written in shrapnel scars, in missing rivets, in bullet holes that never stopped it from reaching home. And its legacy is written in the faces of the crews who stepped out of its hatch after surviving the impossible. Today, the B-17 stands as a monument to courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable will of the thousands who flew into the heart of war so others would not have to. This has been the unknown zone, where history is not forgotten, where legends are not lost, and where the stories of those who fought still rise like echoes through the clouds they once called home.